Salvete Latin one. Oh, it looks like my face is frozen. Oh well, if my face doesn't pick up, then you're just gonna see me hovering there in the corner looking like I just got punched in the face. That's fine. This is part 2 of the chapter 2 notes. If you haven't seen part 1, don't watch this. Go watch the other one. Okay, let's go. So if you flip over to the back of your notes, you'll see at the top, we're talking about the 4 principal parts of a verb. So everything in this second half is a little bit more down in the weeds and not as important to figuring out the meaning of a verb. So if your brain feels full, you can be okay while ignoring this part for now. Just you may want to come back to it later. So either way, let's talk about the 4 principal parts of a verb. The 4 principal parts of a verb is just referring to the entry in the vocabulary list or in a dictionary. When you look up the meaning of a word, of a verb in particular, you'll see that there are either 3 or 4 different versions of it separated by commas, then followed by the definition. These 4 different things are called the 4 principal parts of a verb. They're important for learning a language because without them, there's no real reliable way to know what a verb looks like when it's in these different forms. English is really bad about this. So I have right here some examples of the principal parts for different English verbs as they would be listed in a dictionary made for people who are learning English. Let's start with the verb break. Okay, well, in the present tense, we say break. Like I break a bone, right? So when we go to the past tense, it becomes broke. Well, how would you know that? You wouldn't. Normally we can say like, oh, well, he braked, and now you would kind of know what that meant, but it would sound wrong, right? You will also see a third form, which is called the participle, have broken. It's like, oh, that thing that I've broken is not doing so well. So break, broke, broken. And they're given these 3 forms because it's just to study and memorize, because like I said, there's no other way to really tell. If you're just looking at the word break, there's no way to know that when it becomes past tense, it turns into broke. That's just English being weird. Same with this verb, sing. Okay, well, today I'm singing. What about yesterday? Well, yesterday I sang. Okay, well, why wouldn't it be song, right? Like broke or singed. Okay, but if it's a song that other people sang, or the song that they have sung, turns into a U when it's a participle. Why? We don't know. It just is. See, saw, have seen. Once again, why does see turn into a totally different word? Like the ending, the E, like it just goes away and turns into an AW. Why isn't it not seed? Or saw a say, or so, right? Like it just is. And the only way to know is to just have it told to you and study it. So that's what principal parts do. And that's what the 4 different versions you see when you look up a Latin word are there for. So let's look at this in Latin a little more closely. I'm going to go to this one right here. So here are 2 different verbs that you would see in a Latin dictionary. Saluto, salutare, salutavi, salutatus. And that means to greet. Or video, videre, vidi, visum, means to see. So here in the middle, I kind of have a key telling you what each of these 4 principal parts is doing. For right now, we're only really concerned about the first 2 principal parts. The 3rd and 4th principal part are used later when we are making things past tense, which we are not doing right now. So we're going to ignore those, but I leave them there just so you can have an explanation as to what it means. So even though we're only using the first 2 for now, we're still expected to learn all 4 of these for each word because they're going to be important eventually. So the first principal part is always going to be the first person singular of the present tense. So saluto means I greet. Video means I see. You know this from our last video when we talked about the ending O, meaning that I am the one doing something. The second principal part that you're given is the infinitive form. And infinitive just means that this is what the verb looks like when it doesn't have a subject. In English, we show the infinitive form of a verb by putting the word to in front of the verb. So salutare means to greet, whereas videre means to see. And you can tell the infinitive form in Latin because you'll typically see RE at the end, but you'll notice here that this is ARE and down here this is ERE. And there's really no way, if just by looking at this first part, to know whether the infinitive would have an ARE or an ERE at the end. So that's why you're given these as 2 distinct parts. Okay, so for our purposes in this stage, we're going to learn about verb conjugations. And this is what we're going to use our principal parts to figure out. Verb conjugations are very similar to declensions for nouns that we learned about in chapter 1. Verbs belong to families of other verbs that share certain similarities that we know, and we know those different families as conjugations, whereas a declension is a family of nouns that act similarly. Conjugations are families of verbs that act similarly. Knowing a verb's conjugation is not really that important right now, as it will be soon, but it is going to help us with material we focus on later, so we're going to cover it right now. Like nouns, you can determine the conjugation of a verb based on its first and second, the ending of its first and second principal parts. Similar to a noun, if you see lupa, lupi, the first principal part ends with an A, second principal part ends with an AE, we know that means it belongs to the first declension. So let's look how we apply this same principle to verbs. So, in total, there are 4-ish conjugations. I say 4-ish for a reason, but we'll get to that later. Today, we're only going to talk about the first two, the first and second conjugation. So here's some examples of first conjugation verbs. Here's some examples of second conjugation verbs. Looking at these first two principal parts, do you see a pattern as to what determines what is a first conjugation verb versus a second conjugation verb? You'll see that first conjugation verbs are identified primarily by their second principal part, their infinitive form, ending with ARE, whereas the second principal part, hold up real quick. I apologize, I was rudely interrupted. So, so first conjugation verbs, you'll typically see an ARE in the second principal part. In the second conjugation verbs, you'll see an ERE at the end of the second principal part. I also have the first principal parts underlined as well. First conjugation typically ends with an O in the first principal part, and second conjugation verbs end with an EO in the second principal part. In the first principal part, sorry. And that'll be, once again, that's going to be more important later, but, and so I'm not going to talk much more about that. Just ARE first, ERE second, and you're good. And that's it for this. So we've covered how verbs change to match their subject. We've talked about the infinitive form, we've talked about the principal parts, and we've talked about conjugations. Hopefully this was helpful. If you need to go back and look, I highly suggest it. I'm also going to include in the master presentation on the slide right after this one, I'm going to include some links to videos on this channel called Latin Tutorial, done by Magister Ben Johnson, who is much smarter than I am and makes way better videos. So if you are confused by my explanation, his will probably help you more. Please feel free to use that. I miss you all, and we'll see you soon. Walete.